In other videos, we've already talked about how classical Greece has had an immeasurable impact, not just on Western civilization, but on civilization as a whole. And in order to understand the period that we call classical Greece, it's valuable to place it in context on a timeline. So I have significant conflicts or events that happened to the Greek world on this timeline, especially in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. In the beginning of the 5th century BCE, you have the Greco-Persian Wars, where the Greek city-states are able to fend off attack from the great Persian Empire, and then they go on the offensive. But as we exit the 5th century BCE, the city-states start fighting amongst themselves. You have Athens leading the Delian League in a fight against Sparta and their allies, which significantly weakens the city-states. It ends with Athens losing, but all of the city-states have been weakened, and it leaves them open to be conquered by the Macedonians, in particular Philip of Macedonia, and then his son Alexander the Great is able to not just keep control of Greece, of the city-states, but conquer Egypt and Persia and get all the way to modern-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. But after his death, you then have his successors, and Greece falls under the Antigonid dynasty. But eventually, as we get into the 2nd and 1st century BCEs, it goes under Roman control. And we've talked about this classical period, all of the various contributions. We've talked about the contributions in philosophy from people like Socrates, and Socrates' student Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. But there were also significant contributions in mathematics. You have Pythagoras, who actually predates these philosophers, and he's most famous, especially to many of us, for his Pythagorean theorem and a lot of mathematics and the foundations of a lot of geometry. But he and his followers, they were actually creating something of a mysticism, of a religion around mathematics, and even a philosophy that would later influence some of the other philosophers that we talk about, especially this ideal of ideal Platonic forms. You can imagine if you're studying perfect right triangles, there's no such thing as a perfect right triangle in the universe. These are ideas that we use in geometry, and other things in the universe are really just approximations of these. But to appreciate the philosophical side of Pythagoras, here are some quotes from him, or quotes ascribed to him. "There is geometry in the humming of the strings. There is music in the spacing of the spheres. Reason is immortal, all else mortal." And you'll see even in the 6th century BCE, this thread of Greek thinking, putting reason at a very high level, not just trying to explain everything with pure mysticism. Although Pythagoras definitely was, and Pythagoreanism was definitely about mysticism, but it was mysticism that at the core had mathematics and geometry. But continuing on with significant mathematical contributions from ancient Greece, we have Euclid. We don't know all of the exact details of his birth and his death, but he is the father of modern geometry. And as you can see in this map here, he didn't live in what we call Greece proper today. He lived in Alexandria, a city established by Alexander the Great. And this is during the Hellenistic period, where all of the territory that had, or most of the territory that had been conquered by Alexander the Great, was still ruled by his successors. Egypt was ruled by Ptolemy, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty in the time of Euclid. And Euclid lived in that great center of learning and the arts, Alexandria, which even exists today. And he is most famous for his elements. This is a much later printing of his elements, of Euclid's elements. But you would be amazed how much of modern geometry has been described by Euclid. Even your geometry textbook can trace it back directly to Euclid's elements. Abraham Lincoln famously learned every proof in Euclid's elements in order to fine-tune his mind. So you can really view Euclid as the father of geometry. But that's not all. There are many other contributors in philosophy and math. And this is just Once again, a sample of all of the folks who contributed. On the side of philosophy, you have Xenophon, who is another one of Socrates' students in addition to Plato. And in fact, the life of Socrates we learn from the writings of Plato and Xenophon. Xenophon was also a historian who gave us some accounts of the later Peloponnesian War. You have the famous cynics, Antisthenes, and his student Diogenes. Diogenes famous for living in a barrel in Athens and somewhat insulting Alexander the Great. But these cynics, which the word is derived from being dog-like, these are people who were philosophers who gave up the trappings of materialism and caring, frankly, what other people thought. As we go a little bit out of our timeline right over here, you have Archimedes, one of the greatest mathematicians and scientists of all time. But you also have contributions in the arts. Some of the most famous playwrights of the ancient time: Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, we might remember as being a bit of a thorn in the side of Socrates. He wrote about Socrates, but it was more of a parody. You have contributions in medicine. The famous Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, still has an influence on modern medicine. You have some of the earliest, what we could say, historians that we know of. Herodotus, famously giving us the accounts we have of the Greco-Persian Wars, a lot of what we even know about the ancient Persian Empire. You have Thucydides, who gives us accounts of the Peloponnesian War, along with Xenophon. And so when you see this density of arts, sciences, learning in one place, a lot of this was centered in Athens. It makes you wonder what was going on at that time. And historians do call the period from when the Athenians were able to fend off the Persians all the way until the end of the Peloponnesian War as the golden age of Athens. And for good reason. Look at this flourishing of the arts and the sciences that developed during that period. You might wonder what was happening in terms of government. And government of this period might be one of the longest lasting influences. As we exit the 6th century BCE in 507, you have Greek democracy taking root in Athens. And in fact, the word democracy is a Greek word, government by the people. And shortly after that, during the golden age of Athens, you start having leadership by Pericles. He was an orator, he was a statesman, he was a general. In this period right over here that I have in orange, often known as the Age of Pericles, he helped Athens invest significantly in the arts and in architecture. Some of the most iconic structures we now associate with Greece or ancient Greece were built during his time. They were promoted by him. Here you have a picture of the Acropolis, which is this rock outcropping, which still exists in Athens, as it likely looked during the time of Pericles, during the golden age of Athens. And you can see here in particular, the most famous structure, the Parthenon, a lot of which still stands today, was constructed under the rule of Pericles. As I mentioned, the Greek city-states get conquered by the Macedonians, but after the death of Alexander the Great, falls under the control of the Antigonid dynasty. But eventually, as we get into the 2nd century BCE, off of this timeline, it comes under Roman control, becomes part of the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire is itself significantly influenced by Greek culture, Greek mathematics, Greek architecture, Greek philosophy. And in a lot of ways, the Romans end up becoming the caretakers of much of this culture that we talk about in this video. And once you have the decline of the Roman Empire, especially the Western Roman Empire, and Europe enters into the Middle Ages, you have the Islamic world that acts as a bit of a bridge of this Greek culture into the European Renaissance and eventually the Enlightenment. And so we can trace even our modern views of science and philosophy all the way back to these Greeks. And so I'll leave you with this quote from the Roman poet Horace, who wrote this around the 1st century BCE. Captive Greece took captive her fierce conqueror and instilled her arts in rustic Latium or Latium. And so what he's saying is, even though Rome had conquered Greece, Greece's culture took captive her conqueror, took captive the Roman culture, instilled Greece's arts in the rustic Latin world.
Awesome, right? Awesome overview there of the golden age of classical Greece, right? 5th century Greece. All right, so that was really good overview of kind of what we're going to be going through today. Okay, many of you may want to do your virtual CPT like something like that, right? And that's fine. That is definitely an option. So I need some readers. So if you want to read, please write your name down. I'll give you about a minute. Write your name down if you want to be one of my readers today. I encourage you to write your name down. Write your names down if you want to read. Okay, good. Already lots of readers. Keep them coming. Okay, good. So let's start with our first reader, and that will be Tina. Tina HD. Can you read, please? Tina HD.
Sure, sir. Ancient Greece, Part 2. Okay, so classical Greece from 500 to 336 BCE. So a polis, which is a city-state, all had its own form of government, laws, and money. And some examples were Corinth, Thebes, Athens, and Sparta. So the dominance of Athens' political power was the Delian League. The construction of the Parathon and Acropolis, full development of democracy under Pericles of Athens. The classical age of Greece produced great literature, poetry, philosophy, drama, philosophical thinkers, and art.
Good. So some of this we've already went through, right? Pericles, the Delian League, the construction of the great Parthenon on top of the Acropolis, right? We know what the polis is, a city-state with many different functions. And of course, these are the most popular city-states that we've learned of. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and Corinth. We're going to spend a lot of time on Greek architecture as well today. Tina.
So Greek architecture. So the Parthenon, Acropolis, the statue of Athena, public buildings, columns, marble, and frieze.
Take a look at how beautiful this structure is, right? The Parthenon, statue of Athena, just so beautiful. And the Greek columns. So today we're going to learn about Greek columns. There are 3 Greek columns. Tina.
So the Greek columns. The Greeks developed 3 different orders. There's the Doric and Ionic, and this is from the 6th century BCE, and the Corinthian, which is from the 5th century BCE and was further developed and used by the Romans.
Yeah, so you see this transition of the oldest, which is the Doric order, and then in the middle you have the Ionic order. There's like scrolls here where the Doric order is very plain, okay, with their pillars or their what they call the drum. And then the Corinthian was the newest one in the 5th century, and you see there's a lot of very beautiful leaves. Looks like leaves at the top of the drum, and the Romans just love this type of order, the Corinthian. You see this all over the ancient world in Rome. More pictures. This again is on the Acropolis. Parthenon, the beautiful drums here, Doric style. You see the frieze up here with work being done. It's hard to tell right now. There's a lot of work being done to try to reconstruct some of these buildings. You can see here them working on it. Okay, Tina.
Greek art. So the first to use 3D on a flat surface by using different shades to give illusion of depth. So there was a focus on the concept of the ideal, so beautiful, lifelike, youthful, calm expressions. There was a depiction of gods. The statues were of nude forms and were detailed and proportional. There was an emphasis on elaborating on existing styles, and money was devoted to building theaters, stadiums, gymnasiums, and tombs.
Yeah. Theaters, stadiums, gymnasiums, tombs, right? The way they built theaters is how we build them today. They're very similar style. Okay? Get this idea of, or the focus on the concept of the ideal, right? Talk more about the Greek art in the next few slides. And of course, you can't talk about Athens without democracy, right? Tina, tell us about Athenian democracy.
All right, sir. So Athenian democracy. So demos equals people and kratos equals rule. So it was made up of monarchy and kings, and there was a rise in power of aristocracy and oligarchy. The hoplites of 675 to 650 BCE. There was an age of tyrants and democratic reforms by Solon and Cleisthenes. And the three pillars of Athenians' democracy is number one, the Council of 500, number two, the Assembly, and three, the courts. And Athens lived under a radically democratic government from 508 until 322 BCE. The people governed themselves, debating and voting individually on issues great and small, from matters of war and peace to the proper qualifications for ferry boat captains.
Thank you so much. So this is basically the timeline in the Archaic Age. Of course, you had monarchy and kings, right? And as we make our way towards the 5th century, you do have a limited time in the rise of power of the aristocracy, the nobles, the oligarchy, which is the rule by few or rule of few. Then you get the short period of the hoplite soldiers, right? Run by the military, okay, or the military elite. And then you have the age of the tyrants, okay, short-lived until we get the reformers of Solon and Cleisthenes, okay, the two famous, which they brought the Council of 500. So you have councils, you have assemblies, you have courts, similar, not the same, but like you would see today in our democracy. Okay, so these would be the three pillars of what they brought to the table with the reforms in the 5th century. And you would have read this if you went through the reading package yesterday. It would have talked about this. Yeah. And what about daily life in Athens? What was daily life like? I don't think we really talked too much about daily life. KD, please.
Okay, so the daily life in Athens. So only men could be citizens. Men ran the government. The open expression of homosexuality, words, behavior, literature, and visual arts, especially between older men and young boys. Advancements in culture, thinking, literature, philosophy, wealth, expansion, and trade. And then reliance on slaves and women opened up free time for men to discuss philosophy and participate in politics. Then for women could not vote, hold office, or own property, and did mostly household duties. Education involved spinning, weaving, and domestic arts. And then at 15 years old, girls were considered ready for marriage. And then finally, the slaves. The ratio of slaves to free men was quite high, as historians estimate that as much as 40% of people in Athens Athens area were slaves.
Wow. Yep.
Slaves were household servants, had few rights. Some could gain freedom from generous owners. So yeah, it's almost 50% of their population just being slaves.
Yep. So you can see here the ones who had rights, the ones who were citizens, were men, right? Adult men, okay? There were roles for women in ancient Greece, and of course, there was slavery in ancient Greece. And you could see quite a high population of slaves, right? At 40%. Okay. Now, I don't think it's good enough for me to tell you what life was like. I want to show you just a short TEDx of a day in the life of ancient Greece or ancient Athens. Let's see what it was really like.
It's 427 BCE, and the worst internal conflict ever to occur in the ancient Greek world is in its fourth year. The Peloponnesian War is being fought between the city-states of Athens and Sparta, as well as their allies. The Athenians can't match the formidable Spartan army on land, so they've abandoned the countryside and moved inside the walls surrounding their city and port, now provisioned by a superior fleet and extensive maritime empire. The cramped conditions have taken a toll, and a recent plague wiped out a third of the population, but city life goes on. Archias and Dexaleia live in the center of Athens. As a painter of high-class pottery, Archias is relatively well off and takes great interest in the city's affairs. Dexaleia, on the other hand, can't participate in politics or own property. The couple are grateful to the gods that 3 of their 4 children, a son and 2 daughters, have survived past infancy. Many parents see daughters as a liability, since they require dowries to find husbands. But Archias is confident that his wealth will allow him to make good matches for them without going bankrupt. Like many Athenians, the family owns slaves. Originally from Thrace, they were captured in war. Thrata does most of the housework and helps raise the children. Philon is a pedagogos, who supervises the son's education, teaching him reading and writing. Archias is up early because there's a meeting of the Ecclesia, the assembly of citizens, taking place at dawn. Before setting out, he burns incense and pours a libation at the small shrine in the courtyard, on behalf of his entire household. Dexaleia will remain at home all day, teaching her daughters domestic skills. Later, she'll retire to the inner courtyard for some fresh air. When Archias arrives at the Agora, the civic and commercial heart of the city, he finds the square swarming with his fellow citizens, native-born adult males who have completed military training. Attached to the central monument is a notice board with the meeting's agenda. Today, there's only one item of discussion: what to do with the people of Mytilene, a city on the island of Lesbos where a revolt against Athenian rule has just been put down. The meeting takes place on a hill west of the Acropolis, known as the Pnyx. The word means tightly packed, and the crowd of 5,000 citizens makes it clear why. The heralds purify the hill by sprinkling its boundary with pig's blood and call for order. As everyone sits on benches facing the platform, the presiding officer opens the meeting with the words, "Tis agoreven boulete," who wishes to address the assembly. One by one, citizens speak, some advising mercy, others bent on vengeance. A motion is proposed to execute all the Mytileneans and enslave their women and children because they betrayed their Athenian allies during a time of war. A majority raises their right hands in favor. Once the meeting's over, Archias heads back to the Agora to buy food and wine. Hundreds have gathered there to discuss the results, many unhappy with the decision. When Archias returns home, he tells Dexaleia about the debate. She thinks that killing the innocent as well as the guilty is harsh and counterproductive, and tells him as much. Around dusk, Archias goes to a friend's house for a symposium. The 9 men drink wine and discuss the meeting well into the night. Archias shares his wife's opinion, urging mercy, and his friends eventually agree. Before dawn, something unprecedented happens. Heralds circulate throughout Athens, announcing the council has called another meeting. The second debate is equally heated, but a new resolution, to execute only the leaders of the revolt, narrowly passes. Yet there's a problem. a ship with orders to carry out the first resolution was dispatched the previous day. And so another ship quickly set sail to countermand the order, a race of democracy against time. Did you enjoy this glimpse of daily life in an ancient civilization? If so, check.
All right. So there you had the daily life in ancient Athens, men, women, children, and slaves in Athens, in ancient Greece. And now let's move our attention, KD, to across the Peloponnese into Sparta. Okay, let's learn about the Spartan government and how
Okay.
it's much different from that of Athens.
So the Spartan government, democratic, monarchical oligarchy.
Yeah.
Government ruled by a council, so that just means made up of 2 kings, aristocracy, and 28 nobles over age of 60, who made most political decisions and foreign policy and was supreme criminal court. So the assembly of the Spartiate,
Spartiate. Yeah, Spartiate.
Spartiate democracy. Spartan males over the age of 30 who could vote, veto.
Yeah, veto. Yeah.
Okay, who could veto and approve decisions made by kings and council. 5 F4s, oligarchy, led the council and ran the military and educational system and could veto any ruling made by the council or assembly.
Remember, veto means to go against a vote, right?
Oh,
So
okay.
if there's a vote that's been handed out or made, if you can veto it, it means you can deny the resolution. You can deny it from being accepted, right? You're saying no. That's a veto. Yep.
So Spartan government was considered one of the most stable in all of ancient Greece, led to a warrior and military state above individual.
Good.
And
So you
then,
can see it. Yep. Sorry.
So Ares, god of war, was a patron god of the city, of wars, battles, and warriors, and also of fearlessness in battle.
Yes, Ares, the god of war, right? So thank you. So you can see the Spartan government was more of an aristocracy, an oligarchy, ruled by a few, and those few were older men, right? The council was over the age of 60, right? Males over the age of 30 could veto, could approve. But again, the government here was led by mostly males over 60 and by the military, soldiers, military officers, right? So you can see their line of thinking and how it's much different from that of ancient Athens, more of a democracy. So it was led to a warrior and military state. Good. KD, continue. Daily life in Sparta.
So the daily life in Sparta. The men, at 30, men became citizens and could vote in assembly, marry, and own a house. Educated in reading, fitness, and use of weapons. Boys started military training at the age of 7, joined the military at the age of 20, and end of military service at the age of 60. Soldiers given land which was farmed by the helots,
which are slaves. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So then the woman, girls taught reading and writing, participated in running and wrestling, foot races and stage battles. Wives of Spartan soldiers supervised farms, expected and driven to produce strong and healthy children and be loyal to the state. And Spartan women can own and control property but held no political rights.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, their slaves. Slaves were called helots, agriculture slaves, peasants, made up 2/3 of population, and they were the defeated Mysian peoples. Attempted revolt in 640 BCE, but was crushed. This forced Sparta to create a stronger army.
Yes, good. So there was always worry back at home that, again, there would be uprisings and revolts of the helots, of the slaves, because you can see it made up most of their population. 2/3 of the population were helots, were slaves. So there was always that fear of a revolt, right? And did happen many times in different parts of Sparta. So that was always a fear in the Spartans. And you can see here, boys started military training at the age of 7, joined the military at 20 until the age of 60. Okay. So you could see what they valued, what the Spartans valued, right?
Sir, I had a question.
Sure.
What was the age expectancy of like the men and women in Sparta and for Athens, I guess?
Not very long. Again, their children that were born, many didn't make it past 5. It's hard to say. Not many made it past 60, but it depended on, again, what your occupation was, right? What you did for a living, depended on if you were wealthy, depended on if you were a slave. So it kind of depended on your class. That was part of it, of course. But yeah, I mean, if you made it to 60, wow, that was well done. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, sir.
Yeah. Sorry. Hold on a second. I kind of lost it here. Okay, let's change readers. Layla, are you there? Are you with us, Layla?
Hi, sir.
Hi. So let's move on to Greek philosophy and thinkers. You've heard of some of these names before.
Philosophers: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Establishment of philosophical schools that examine issues such as true knowledge, the soul, love, beauty, and scientific learning. Logical thinking, rhetoric, politics. Playwrights: Sophocles,
Euripides.
Euripides.
Yeah, some of these are tough. Hippocrates, Archimedes, Pythagoras, like in mathematics. Yeah, so some of these names, I even have trouble saying them. It's yeah. So let's move on to the Hellenistic era. Again, I'm just going through a quick overview here. The Hellenistic era in Greece. Layla.
The period between conquest of Persian Empire by Alexander the Great to establishment of Roman supremacy. The word Hellenistic is derived from the word Hellen, which was the Greek word for the Greeks. The Hellenistic age Hellenized the world due to the spread of Greek culture and language throughout Near East, Mediterranean, and Asia Minor. They exported Greek culture, architecture, politics, law, literature, philosophy, religion, and art as models of perfection.
Good. So that, remember, the Hellenistic age is, we refer to the age of Philip and Alexander, and this is when Alexander conquered much of Asia Minor, into the Middle East, all the way out to India and Pakistan, and he was able to spread the Greek culture. That's the Hellenistic era. And what about barter and trade and coinage? We haven't talked about that in a while. Layla.
So there was trade by sea, and the most important crops were olive and grapes. Items traded were olive oil, wine, silver, white marble, pottery, furniture, jewelry, textiles for grain, glass, ivory, and timber. Trade by the barter system. Coinage emerged from metallurgy that was weighed. 8th and 7th century BCE, silver pieces were stamped by the government. First mints in 7th BCE by Lydia. By the 5th century BCE, most common coinage in Mediterranean was Athens coin, with owl on one side and Athena on the other.
See that? Owl on one side and Athena on the other. So this is, again, during the Classic Age, you get the most common coinage in the Mediterranean. So when we think of legacies, very important here, the legacies of Greece, what do we think of? Okay, nice and loud, Layla. What are the legacies of Greece? What do you guys need to remember when we think of the legacies to Western civilization, please?
City-states, polis, thought and philosophy, Greek language, politics, democracy, great thinkers, art and architecture, and myths and literature.
Mhm. So today, our main focus today is going to be this one, art and architecture. So that was, again, an intro to classical Greece, and today is ancient Greece architecture. Okay. Let's go through this one, and yeah. I mean, if you talk about ancient Greece, you really have to talk about the architecture and the arts. Who did we have as reader? Oh, David. David, please. So here we see the columns again. The frieze. Yeah, we're going to learn about that. Let's take a look at these three. The Doric. David, which one do you like best? Do you like the plain? Do you like the scrolls, or do you like the leaves? Which one do you like? Yes. Okay. Okay, you could see here the names of the Doric orders, the frieze up here, the capital here, which is plain. Okay. Uh, the shaft, or also known as the drums here, which is the pillar. See, the Parthenon is of Doric order. Okay. Find that it was built. David? The Erechtheum. David. That's this one right here with these pillars of the here, the Erechtheum. That's not me. I cannot take credit for that. Temple of Athena. You can see the thickness of the Doric drum or pillar and how slender. It's skinnier. We move on to the Corinthian. So I have here, this is a sheet here, this Greek architecture sheet. Do you see this? This is something, if you're at home and you have a printer, I would really, really like it if you can just print this out. Okay. Or if you don't have a printer and you don't, I would actually like you on a separate sheet of paper, if you can maybe try to just, sketch it out a little bit. And then I would like you to label. I would like you to label just like I have here. And as we watch this video on Greek architecture, I would like you just to jot down notes from the video on specifically these three orders. Okay. So again, if you can print this out, do that for me. If not, just on a separate sheet of paper or on a Google Doc, just jot down notes from what you learned of each order. Okay.
Architecture is a language, and you know how when you learn a new vocabulary word, you start to notice it for the first time everywhere? Well, the same thing happens with architecture. When you learn a new architectural form, you start to see it everywhere.
And that's especially true of the classical orders, because these are what are essentially the building blocks of Western architecture, and they've been used for 2,500 years.
We're basically talking about styles of architecture that the ancient Greeks had developed mostly for their temples. And you're right, that we've continued to use.
And we've got several contemporary examples up along the top.
But what's important to remember is that it's just a fancy dressing, really, of a basic ancient building system.
So we brought in Stonehenge to illustrate that ancient building system called post and lintel architecture. This is the most fun.
So please, everybody should be watching now. Don't worry about printing it right now. Again, this is an important video, so everybody should be watching this.
Fundamental, most basic, oldest kind of architectural system. The posts are the vertical elements, and they support a horizontal element called a lintel.
And you know what? We still use this basic system when we nail 2x4s together. And that's what the Greeks were doing, but they were doing it in a much more sophisticated way.
Right, they developed decorative systems, and that's what we're referring to when we use the term classical orders. There are three basic orders: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. There's a couple extra, but we're not going to go into those today, but we've listed them here for you just so you know what they are: the Tuscan and the Composite. So the Doric and Ionic and Corinthian are illustrated here in this diagram. First the Doric, then the Ionic, and then the last two are Corinthian. These are just slight variations of these three orders.
And the Doric is really the most simple. The Ionic a little bit more complicated, and then the Corinthian, completely out of control.
So let's start with the oldest order, the Doric order.
Right, and we think that this order began in the 7th century on the mainland in Greece, and we're looking at an actual Greek temple that happens to be in Italy, but nevertheless is just a great example of the Doric in the classical era.
Let's start at the top with the pediment. The pediment isn't officially part of the order, but since Greek temples had at one end or the other a pediment, we just thought we would name that for you, and that's that triangular space at the very top of the temple.
Right, these are gabled roofs. Sometimes they would be filled with sculpture.
The next area below the pediment is actually officially part of the order, and that's called the entablature.
Okay, so that would be the area from about here to here.
And the top part of the entablature is called the frieze.
Okay, so only this part right here is known as the frieze. So in other words, this whole section.
Right, and in the Doric order, it is decorated in a very specific way using triglyphs and metopes.
Now, actually, if you look at the word triglyph, you notice that the prefix is tri. Just like tricycle, it means 3. And the suffix glyph means mark. So a triglyph literally means 3 marks. And you can see patterns of 3 marks moving all the way across the frieze.
And then in between the triglyphs are spaces that are called metopes. And in ancient Greek architecture, these were often filled with sculpture.
Now, the triglyphs we don't think are just arbitrary. We think that they probably came from a time when temples were built out of wood, and these would have been the ends of planks that would have functioned as beams in the temple. And they would have, of course, been supported directly over the columns. You'll notice that every other one, at least, is aligned directly over the columns.
So as we move down the temple, the next area we come to is the capital.
And this is a Doric capital. It's very simple. It's got a flare, and then it's got a simple slab on top.
So the Doric is the oldest, the most severe, and was associated, according to the ancient Roman architectural historian Vitruvius, with masculine form.
It is broad, it's not tall, and it feels heavy.
It does. As we continue to move down, we come to the area that we commonly call the column, but art historians call the shaft.
And if you look closely, you can see that it is not entirely plain. There are actually vertical lines that move across the entire surface, known as flutes. Now, in the Doric, a flute is very shallow, and really what it is it's a kind of scallop that's been carved out of the surface.
And what fluting does is it creates a nice vertical decorative pattern along the shaft.
Now, one of the other defining features of the Doric order is that at the bottom of the shaft, there is no decorative foot. The shaft of the column goes straight into the floor of the temple.
And you can see that really well in the detail on the lower right, where there's no molding there to make a transition. So let's have a look at what these look like in person.
Capitals are up high, so we would never see a person next to them. And I think it's easy to not realize just how big they are. But I snapped this terrific picture of you at the British Museum next to a capital that actually comes from the most famous Doric temple on the Acropolis in Athens.
Right, the Parthenon, and they really are massive. And this photo is good also for seeing, in this case, a reconstruction, but giving you a sense of the entablature with that frieze with triglyphs and metopes. And we've got an example on the right of a relief sculpture that was for one of the metopes on the Parthenon.
Right, so this metope here would have actually fit right in one of these squares.
Let's talk about one last element that we find in Doric architecture, and that's something called entasis.
Now, this is a little tricky because I think most people assume that a column is straight up and down. That is, the sides of a column are parallel with each other, and the base of a column is just as wide as the area directly below the capital. But in fact, the ancient Greeks didn't build their temples that way.
No, it's fascinating to think about all the ways that the ancient Greeks are thinking about how to make their buildings beautiful and speak of the realm of the gods. And so when we look at an ancient Doric temple, we see that the shafts swell a little bit toward the center.
So right about a third of the way down, they would be at their widest, and it would taper ever so slightly towards the bottom and taper much more so as we move up to the top, so that the narrowest point
of the column shaft would be right at the top, and the widest part would be about a third of the way from the base.
And so the building has a sense of liveliness that I think it wouldn't have if the column was exactly the same width at the top as at the bottom.
Architectural historians have debated why the Greeks bothered to do this, because this was expensive. This was difficult. It meant that every drum that makes up this column had to be an individual, unique piece. These could not be mass measured and mass produced.
Right, so you just used the word drum. So the columns are not actually carved from one piece of stone.
And if you look very carefully at this photograph, you can just make out the seams between those drums. There would also have generally been a hole that would have gone through the center of each of these pieces, so that a piece of wood sometimes would actually string them together, almost like beads on a necklace. One of the other things that Entasis does is to emphasize the verticality of the temple. Because they get narrower as they go further up, it seems as if the shaft of the column might actually be taller than it really is, because of course, as things move away from us, they get smaller in scale.
So the Greeks are thinking about human perception. They're thinking about how we see, not just an abstract idea of math and geometry, but actually human experience, which says something about ancient Greek culture.
One last detail. The entasis gives the shaft of the column a sense of almost elasticity, that it is bearing the weight of the stone above it.
It's really fascinating to think about all of these decisions that the Greeks are making as they build. So let's look at the Ionic order, which emerges shortly after the Doric order. Here's another building on the Acropolis. This is the Erechtheion.
This is such a different aesthetic. There's such a sense of delicacy here. There is not that sense of mass, that sense of the muscularity of the buildings that we associate with the Doric.
And in fact, Vitruvius, the ancient Roman architectural historian, saw this as a more feminine order. It's taller, it's thinner.
Now, one of the columns from this building in Greece is in the museum in London. We have some good photographs of it.
And you can see the distinguishing feature really is at the top, at the capital, where we see these scroll-like shapes, also known as volutes. We also see a slightly different type of fluting. And we also, importantly, see a base. Let's move to the Corinthian order. This looks really different and is the most decorative. And the distinguishing feature here is, again, the capital, where we see leaf-like shapes.
They also have bases. They tend to be taller than the Doric, just like the Ionic, but they are highly decorative. There's a great myth about the origin of the Corinthian capital.
It's a kind of fun story. Of course, we have no idea whether this is true, but the story is that there was a young girl who died and her possessions were placed in a basket and put on top of her grave. Underneath that basket was a acanthus plant that began to grow, and because the heavy basket with the tile on top was on top, the acanthus leaves grew out to the side.
Well, if we look at a Corinthian column, it really does look like that.
It looks exactly like that.
And so it's a great myth whether or not it's true. So the Corinthian order is the most complex. It includes both the scroll that we would expect to see in the Ionic,
the volutes,
right, but also these very complex leaf-like forms, which you can just make out here, which is actually from the acanthus leaf. And we have a photograph of an acanthus leaf right down here.
And these grow wild, so it makes sense.
What's important to remember is that the ancient Greeks, although they developed these three classical orders, were just the genesis. The Romans took these ideas over, and then subsequently, people who've looked back to the classical tradition have borrowed from them yet again. And we still do this today. And there you have it, the Greek orders.
All right, so there's a very good example there of the different orders in ancient Greece. Okay, really in depth. Okay. So what do you guys think of taking maybe a 5-10 minute break? Okay, you guys want to take just a short break? Okay, if you have to go to the washroom or just take a break. Okay, so you have 5 minutes. Okay, we'll meet at 1:35. Okay. Okay. Oh, I missed some here. Okay, guys, welcome back from your 10-minute break. Hopefully everybody's okay. And you're still following me, so I'm just going to go through what I want you to do right now. Let me just update this here. So I'm going to give you some time to go through what I posted today. Okay. You could continue read both PowerPoints. Okay. There's a 10-minute video I'd like you to watch. It's called Athenian Democracy. Okay. On Cleisthenes. I would like you to watch. That's really good. And I've also given you just a package here of notes. So you don't really have to take notes. You have it here. So if you watch the video and hear your notes that I've posted, okay, that's what I would like you to do. And if you go to homework, I posted what was yesterday's homework here, okay, which was the Democratic Experiment Package. This was yesterday's homework. If you finish this, please post it. Some of you did already. Tonight, I'm just going to assign a reading, and that's this one here, Society and Culture in Ancient Greece. Okay, that's what I'm going to assign today. If you didn't do yesterday's homework, then you have to do both. Okay? And chapter 7 could be found here. Okay. So this is what I want you to do tonight, chapter 7 reading and yesterday's homework. And just to finish off the course, guys, or to finish off the lesson, just go through what I posted here today. Just read through it. And please watch this video, Athenian Democracy. It's about 10 minutes. Okay. My throat is hurting a little bit, so I'm not going to teach anymore. I'm going to let you guys go through it on your own, but I'm still going to be here, of course. Okay. Do we understand? Somebody say yes if you understand. Yes.
Yeah.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Do we have to hand in like the labeled like the columns, the labeled columns?
The label call you're gonna have to hand that in eventually. I did not. You don't have to send it in yet. But I do want you to complete that. Yes.
Okay.
It's just a sketch. That's all it is on a sheet of paper.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah. That's all that is just a sketch. Okay, so your homework tonight really is just the reading and finish up what we did today. Okay. Thank you, guys.